The most powerful man in human history was terrified of a single thing dying, and that fear turned him into history's most brutal control freak. Picture this. It's 220 BCE, and the Emperor of China has just ordered the execution of 460 scholars for simply owning books. Their crime: possessing knowledge that might help someone else live forever instead of him. The screams echo through the palace as servants bury these intellectuals alive, one by one, while their emperor watches from his jade throne, convinced that eliminating competition will grant him eternal life. But here's the twisted part: you're living under the exact same psychological manipulation right now. Every time you see a celebrity obsessing over anti-aging treatments, every time a billionaire pours millions into life extension research, every time you scroll past another "live forever" health hack, you're witnessing the same death anxiety that created the most oppressive surveillance state in ancient history. This emperor's paranoia about mortality didn't just kill thousands, it invented techniques of population control so effective that authoritarian regimes still use them today. The apps on your phone, the cameras on every corner, the way information is filtered and controlled, it all traces back to one man's desperate terror of dying. By the end of this video, you'll understand how the fear of death doesn't just drive individuals insane, it creates systems of control that can enslave entire civilizations. Here's how China's first emperor turned his personal nightmare into everyone else's living hell. Meet Qin Shi Huang, the man who unified China, and then tried to unify death itself under his control. But before he was the first emperor, he was just Ying Zheng, a paranoid prince who inherited a kingdom built on violence and lived every day knowing that assassination was just one meal away. Picture the world he grew up in: 7 warring kingdoms tearing each other apart, where trust was a luxury that got you killed and paranoia was the only survival skill that mattered. By age 13, he'd already survived multiple assassination attempts. By 25, he was sleeping in a different room every night, testing his food with silver, and executing anyone who looked at him wrong. And here's where it gets psychological: this wasn't just political caution. This was clinical thanatophobia, the pathological fear of death weaponized into a governing philosophy. Sound familiar? Think about how today's tech billionaires obsess over biohacking, cryonics, and AI immortality. Think about how authoritarian leaders create elaborate security states, not just to maintain power, but because they're genuinely terrified of their own mortality. The psychology is identical when someone with unlimited resources becomes convinced that death is optional. They'll sacrifice anything and anyone to avoid it. But Qin Shi Huang took this further than anyone in history. He didn't just want to avoid death, he wanted to eliminate it entirely, starting with himself and extending to complete control over every aspect of life and death in his empire. What started as personal anxiety evolved into the world's first total surveillance state, where every citizen became a potential threat to the emperor's immortality project. The psychological principle at work here is called terror management theory. When humans are reminded of their mortality, they cling desperately to anything that promises permanence or meaning. For most people, that's religion, legacy, or family. But when you give someone absolute power and pathological death anxiety, they don't just cling to immortality symbols, they try to become immortal themselves. And the methods Qin Shi Huang developed to manage his terror didn't disappear when he died. They became the blueprint for every control-obsessed regime that followed. The surveillance techniques, the information control, the systematic elimination of dissent, these weren't just political strategies. They were the symptoms of one man's psychological breakdown, scaled up to control 20 million people. You're about to see how a single person's fear of death can reshape reality for millions, and why understanding this psychology is crucial for recognizing when it's happening again. Let me paint you the scene that started it all. It's 259 BCE, and 13-year-old Prince Qin Zheng is hiding in a storage room while assassins search the palace. His own mother's lover, a man named Lao Ai, has just attempted a coup, and the sound of clashing swords echoes through the corridors. The boy who would become China's first emperor crouches behind silk tapestries, listening to his guards die one by one, and something breaks inside his mind that night. You can almost feel his heart hammering against his ribs as footsteps approach his hiding spot. Imagine the thoughts racing through his teenage brain. Who can I trust? Who's trying to kill me? How do I make sure this never happens again? That terror, that moment of absolute helplessness, would shape the next 2,000 years of Chinese history. But here's where the psychology gets dark. Most people who experience trauma develop normal coping mechanisms: therapy, support systems, healthy boundaries. But when you're a prince with unlimited resources and no one brave enough to tell you no, trauma doesn't heal, it metastasizes into obsession. By age 20, Qin Zheng had developed what modern psychologists would recognize as a classic paranoid personality disorder, amplified by what researchers call mortality salience, the constant awareness of death that drives extreme behavior. He started sleeping in different rooms every night, never eating the same food twice in a row, and most tellingly, he became obsessed with stories of immortals. Ancient Chinese mythology was full of tales about people who had achieved eternal life through secret knowledge, magical elixirs, and spiritual practices. For most people, these were just stories. But for a traumatized prince with unlimited power, they became a roadmap. He started collecting every text, every scroll, every whispered rumor about immortality techniques. Picture this scene: the young prince in his private library, surrounded by scrolls and tablets, cross-referencing every mention of eternal life, taking notes by candlelight while his guards patrol outside. He's not just reading for entertainment, he's treating these mythical stories like instruction manuals. And here's the psychological trap he fell into. The more he learned about immortality, the more convinced he became that death was optional, and the more terrified he became of anyone else accessing this knowledge. This is where normal death anxiety transforms into something much more dangerous. Psychologists call it death anxiety displacement, when someone becomes so afraid of dying that they start trying to control death itself, usually by controlling other people. The prince began to see every scholar, every philosopher, every person with knowledge as a potential threat to his monopoly on immortality. But that's not the worst part. The worst part is what happened when he finally unified China and became the first emperor. Suddenly, his personal paranoia had 20 million subjects to work with. The transformation was immediate and terrifying. Within months of declaring himself emperor, Qin Shi Huang issued the order that would define his reign: the burning of books and burying of scholars. But this wasn't random destruction, this was strategic elimination of anyone who might compete with his immortality research. Imagine you're a scholar in 213 BCE. You've spent your life studying philosophy, medicine, or astronomy. You've never even met the emperor, never posed any threat to his power. Then soldiers arrive at your door with a list of forbidden books. Everything you've studied, everything you've written, everything that represents human knowledge, it's all going into the fire. And if you're caught hiding even a single scroll, you'll be buried alive. The psychological mechanism at work here is called knowledge hoarding, when someone becomes convinced that information is finite and that sharing it diminishes their own power. But Qin Shi Huang took this to an extreme that had never been seen before. He wasn't just hoarding knowledge, he was trying to become the only person in China who knew anything about life, death, medicine, or philosophy. You're probably thinking this sounds insane, and you're right. But here's what makes it terrifying: it worked. By systematically eliminating anyone with knowledge that might threaten his immortality project, the emperor created a population that was completely dependent on him for information about reality itself. And the psychological control techniques he developed in service of his death anxiety would be copied by every authoritarian regime for the next 2 millennia. The surveillance, the information control, the elimination of intellectual dissent, these weren't political strategies. They were the symptoms of one man's pathological fear of death, implemented with the resources of an empire. But here's where it gets personal. Now, let's dive into the psychology that turned personal trauma into systematic oppression. Because understanding this mechanism is crucial for recognizing when it's happening today. What Qin Shi Huang experienced is what modern psychologists call thanatophobia with omnipotence fantasy, basically. The fear of death combined with the delusion that you can control death if you just accumulate enough power and knowledge. It's rare in normal people, but when it appears in someone with unlimited resources, it creates a specific pattern of behavior that we see repeated throughout history. Here's how the psychology works. First, there's the initial trauma in his case: multiple assassination attempts as a child. This creates what researchers call hypervigilance. The brain gets stuck in constant threat detection mode. Your nervous system is always scanning for danger, always preparing for attack, always convinced that death is imminent. For most people, this settles down over time with proper support and healing. But when you're an emperor with no one to challenge your thinking, hypervigilance doesn't heal, it amplifies. Every shadow becomes an assassin, every scholar becomes a potential rival, every piece of information becomes a weapon that someone might use against you. But here's where it gets interesting from a neuroscience perspective. Recent brain imaging studies show that people with extreme death anxiety actually develop enlarged amygdalas, the fear center of the brain, and decreased activity in the prefrontal cortex, which handles rational thinking. Essentially, Qin Shi Huang's brain was being rewired by fear, making him simultaneously more paranoid and less capable of logical decision-making. Now, add unlimited power to this neurological cocktail. When normal people feel death anxiety, they might buy life insurance or exercise more. When an emperor feels death anxiety, he can order the execution of anyone who makes him feel mortal. This creates what psychologists call a feedback loop of omnipotence. The more people you control, the more immortal you feel, which drives you to control even more people. Think about how this applies today. Every time you see a tech billionaire pouring millions into anti-aging research while simultaneously increasing surveillance of their users, you're watching the same psychological pattern. Every time an authoritarian leader eliminates opposition while building elaborate security systems, you're seeing death anxiety expressed through control. The specific mechanism is called terror management through dominance. When someone becomes convinced that controlling others will help them avoid death, they start viewing every human interaction as a potential threat to their immortality. Qin Shi Huang literally believed that if he could control what every person in China knew, thought, and did, he could control whether he lived or died. This explains the seemingly irrational extremes of his book-burning campaign. From a political perspective, eliminating scholars made no sense. He needed educated people to run his empire. But from a psychological perspective, it was perfectly logical. Every scroll that got burned was a potential threat to his monopoly on life-extending knowledge eliminated. Every scholar who died was one less person who might discover the secret to immortality before he did. The brain scans of modern people with pathological death anxiety show something fascinating. They literally process other people's knowledge and achievements as threats to their own survival. When Qin Shi Huang heard about a scholar who had written about medicine or philosophy, his brain interpreted that information the same way it would interpret news about an approaching army. But here's the truly terrifying part. This psychological pattern doesn't stay contained to one person. It spreads through systems and institutions like a virus. When the emperor demanded absolute control over information, his ministers developed their own paranoia about knowledge. When those ministers created surveillance systems, the local officials became obsessed with monitoring their citizens. When citizens started reporting on each other to avoid suspicion, the entire society became infected with the same death anxiety-driven need for control. Modern research calls this systemic paranoia, when one person's psychological disorder becomes embedded in the structure of an organization or government. And once it's embedded, it becomes self-perpetuating. People start enforcing control not because they personally fear death, but because the system rewards paranoid behavior and punishes trust. You're seeing this exact pattern play out today in surveillance capitalism, authoritarian governments, and even social media algorithms that amplify fear and division. The technology is different, but the underlying psychology is identical. Someone with power and resources becomes convinced that controlling information and behavior will help them avoid death or maintain immortality. And just like in ancient China, the results are devastating for everyone else. Now, let me show you how Qin Shi Huang's immortality obsession evolved from personal paranoia into the world's first totalitarian surveillance state, because this is where his psychological breakdown became everyone else's nightmare. By 210 BCE, the emperor had been searching for immortality for over a decade, and his methods were getting increasingly desperate. Picture this scene, the Forbidden City, but imagine it as a massive laboratory where human beings are the test subjects. Hundreds of alchemists work day and night, mixing mercury, sulfur, and ground pearls into elixirs that they're forced to test on prisoners first, then on themselves. You can almost smell the metallic tang of mercury vapor in the air. See the trembling hands of scholars forced to grind cinnabar into powder, knowing that one mistake means death. The emperor watches from his throne as test subject after test subject convulses and dies from mercury poisoning. But instead of questioning the process, he just orders his alchemists to try different combinations. But here's where the psychology gets truly disturbing. Each failed experiment didn't make him more cautious, it made him more controlling. Every time an elixir killed someone instead of granting immortality, his brain interpreted this as proof that someone, somewhere, was withholding the real secret from him. This is a perfect example of what psychologists call persecutory delusion escalation. When someone with paranoid tendencies faces repeated failures, instead of questioning their assumptions, they become convinced that others are actively sabotaging them. In Qin Shi Huang's mind, every dead alchemist was evidence of a conspiracy. Every failed elixir was proof that someone else had the real formula and was hiding it from him. So he did what terrified people with unlimited power always do: he escalated the surveillance and control. The emperor created what historians now recognize as history's first comprehensive intelligence network. Picture a system where every village had informants, every household had someone reporting to the government, and every conversation was potentially being monitored by agents loyal to the throne. But this wasn't just political control, this was psychological warfare designed to support one man's immortality project. The surveillance network had specific instructions: report anyone who talked about medicine, anyone who practiced alchemy, anyone who claimed to have knowledge about extending life. Essentially, Qin Shi Huang turned his entire empire into a giant filtering system designed to capture any information that might help him live forever. Imagine being a citizen in this system. You're a farmer, a merchant, a craftsman. You have no interest in politics or immortality. But you can't have a conversation about herbal remedies without wondering if someone is reporting you as a potential threat to the emperor's monopoly on life-extending knowledge. You can't share traditional healing practices with your neighbors without risking being identified as someone who might be competing with the emperor's alchemists. The psychological effect on the population was devastating. Modern trauma researchers have a term for this: chronic hypervigilance induction. When an entire society is forced to constantly monitor their own thoughts and behaviors, it creates a state of perpetual stress that literally rewires people's brains. Citizens started self-censoring not just their words, but their thoughts, because thinking the wrong thing might show on their faces and get them reported. And here's the twisted part: this system actually worked to support the emperor's psychological needs. Every report that came in about someone being punished for unauthorized knowledge made him feel more secure in his immortality research. Every citizen who self-censored made him feel like he had successfully eliminated competition for the secrets of eternal life. But the human cost was staggering. Historical records suggest that during the peak of his immortality obsession, Qin Shi Huang was executing an average of 50 people per day for crimes against imperial knowledge. These weren't political rebels or military threats. These were scholars, healers, farmers, and craftsmen whose only crime was knowing something that might theoretically be related to life extension. Picture the scene at one of these mass executions. Hundreds of people buried alive in massive pits, their families forced to watch, while government officials read proclamations about protecting imperial secrets. You can almost hear the dirt hitting the coffins, the muffled screams, the sobbing of children who don't understand why their parents are being killed for owning books. And the emperor? He's back in his laboratory, mixing another batch of mercury elixir, convinced that each execution brings him one step closer to immortality. The psychological disconnect is complete in his mind. These aren't human beings dying. They're obstacles to eternal life being removed. But here's what makes this historical moment so relevant today. The surveillance and control systems that Qin Shi Huang created didn't disappear when he died. They became the template for every authoritarian regime that followed. The techniques of information control, the methods of citizen surveillance, the psychological manipulation tactics, they were all developed in service of one man's pathological fear of death. But they proved so effective at controlling populations that they've been used continuously for over 2,000 years. You're about to see how these ancient techniques are being deployed today, often by people who don't even realize they're following a blueprint created by a madman's immortality obsession. Here's the part that should keep you awake at night. Every technique Qin Shi Huang developed to manage his death anxiety is being used right now today to control your behavior, your attention, and your information access. Think about social media algorithms for a moment. What are they really doing? They're creating filter bubbles that control what information you see, exactly like the emperor's book burning campaigns. When Facebook or TikTok decides what content reaches your feed, they're functioning as digital versions of Qin Shi Huang's information control officers, determining what knowledge you're allowed to access. But here's the psychological connection that most people miss. The billionaires running these platforms are driven by the same death anxiety that motivated the first emperor. Every time you see Elon Musk tweeting about colonizing Mars, Jeff Bezos funding anti-aging research, or tech leaders investing in cryonics, you're witnessing modern versions of the immortality obsession. And just like the emperor, their personal anxiety about mortality is creating systems of control that affect millions of people. Consider the surveillance capitalism model that dominates our digital economy. Companies collect every piece of data about your behavior, your preferences, your relationships, your health, creating a level of monitoring that makes Qin Shi Huang's spy network look primitive. But why? Officially, it's for targeted advertising. Psychologically, it's because the people running these systems are terrified of losing control, of becoming irrelevant, of facing their own mortality. The pattern is identical. Someone with resources and power becomes obsessed with controlling information flow because they believe it will help them achieve some form of immortality, whether that's literal life extension, digital permanence, or simply being remembered forever. And everyone else gets caught in the control system that results from their anxiety. Look at how modern authoritarian leaders operate. They don't start by announcing they want to control everyone. They start by claiming they need to protect people from dangerous information. China's internet censorship, Russia's media restrictions, even content moderation on Western platforms, they all use the same justification that Qin Shi Huang used for burning books, protecting society from harmful knowledge. But the psychological mechanism underneath is always the same. Someone in power is afraid of losing that power, afraid of being forgotten, afraid of dying. So they create systems to eliminate any information or ideas that might threaten their sense of permanence. The workplace surveillance technology that's exploded since 2020 is another perfect example. Employee monitoring software, productivity tracking, digital supervision, these aren't really about efficiency. They're about executives who are terrified of losing control, creating systems that make them feel more powerful and therefore less mortal. Even the current obsession with AI and automation has psychological roots in immortality anxiety. Tech leaders aren't just trying to create useful tools, they're trying to create digital versions of themselves that will outlast their biological deaths. It's the same impulse that drove Qin Shi Huang to search for life-extending elixirs, just updated with 21st century technology. And here's the scariest part. Most of the people implementing these systems don't realize they're following a psychological pattern that was established 2,200 years ago by a paranoid emperor. They think they're being innovative, disrupting industries, or protecting society. But they're actually just scaling up the same fear-driven control mechanisms that created history's first totalitarian state. The question you need to be asking yourself is, when you see these patterns emerging, what are you going to do about it? Let's zoom out and examine the broader pattern here, because understanding this psychological cycle is crucial for preventing it from happening again, and recognizing when it's already happening around you. What we're looking at is what I call the immortality control cycle, a predictable sequence that occurs when someone with power and resources develops pathological death anxiety. It starts with personal trauma, escalates through paranoid thinking, and eventually creates systems of oppression that outlast the original person by centuries. Stage 1 is always the same. A powerful person experiences something that makes them acutely aware of their own mortality. For Qin Shi Huang, it was assassination attempts. For modern tech billionaires, it might be a health scare, a market crash, or simply reaching middle age and realizing that all their money can't stop time. Stage 2 is the knowledge hoarding phase. The person becomes convinced that information is the key to controlling death, so they start accumulating knowledge obsessively while simultaneously preventing others from accessing the same information. This is where book burning, censorship, and information control begin. Stage 3 is the surveillance escalation. As the person's death anxiety increases, they become convinced that others are actively threatening their immortality project, so they create monitoring systems to identify and eliminate potential competitors. This is where we get spy networks, surveillance capitalism, and algorithmic control systems. Stage 4 is the systematic oppression phase. The monitoring systems start generating their own paranoia, creating feedback loops where more control leads to more fear, which leads to more control. At this point, the original person's psychology has become embedded in institutional structures that persist even after they die. And here's the crucial insight. This cycle is always justified using language about protection, security, and helping people. Qin Shi Huang claimed he was protecting China from harmful ideas. Modern surveillance systems claim they're protecting users from misinformation. The rhetoric changes, but the psychological mechanism stays the same. What makes this pattern so dangerous is that each stage seems reasonable in isolation. Who wouldn't want to protect society from dangerous information? Who wouldn't want to monitor potential threats? Who wouldn't want to prevent chaos and maintain order? But when these reasonable-sounding policies are actually symptoms of someone's psychological breakdown, they create systems that are fundamentally opposed to human freedom and dignity. The historical evidence shows this pattern repeating across cultures and centuries. Stalin's purges, Mao's Cultural Revolution, McCarthy's blacklists, the Stasi surveillance system, they all follow the same psychological template established by China's first emperor. Someone in power becomes terrified of losing that power, so they create systems to eliminate anyone who might threaten their sense of permanence. But here's what gives me hope. Understanding this pattern makes it possible to interrupt it. When you can recognize the signs: information hoarding, surveillance escalation, systematic elimination of dissent, you can resist them before they become fully entrenched. The key is understanding that these systems aren't really about politics or ideology, they're about psychology. The people creating them are often driven by subconscious fears that they don't even recognize. When you can see through the rational justifications to the underlying death anxiety, you can address the real problem instead of just fighting the symptoms. This is why historical education is so crucial. Every generation thinks their technology is different, their leaders are different, their situation is unique. But the psychological patterns are remarkably consistent. The tools change, scrolls become books, become websites, become algorithms, but the underlying human fears and the systems they create remain the same. The question isn't whether this cycle will repeat, it's already repeating. The question is whether we'll recognize it in time to prevent it from reaching the systematic oppression phase. And that depends on whether enough people understand the psychology behind it to resist the reasonable-sounding justifications that always accompany the early stages. Because here's the ultimate truth. The systems that control you today were designed by people who are afraid of dying. And understanding that fear is the first step toward reclaiming your freedom. So what happened to China's first emperor, the man who sacrificed millions of lives in his desperate quest for immortality? He died at age 49, killed by the very mercury elixirs he thought would grant him eternal life. Ironic doesn't begin to cover it. The man who created history's most comprehensive surveillance state, who burned libraries and buried scholars alive, who turned an entire civilization into his personal immortality experiment, he poisoned himself with his own paranoia. But here's the truly chilling part. His death didn't end the systems he created. The surveillance networks, the information control mechanisms, the psychological manipulation techniques, they all survived him and became the foundation for every authoritarian regime that followed. His personal nightmare became humanity's permanent inheritance. And those systems are still with us today, embedded in our technology, our institutions, and our governments. Every time you see surveillance justified as safety, information control disguised as protection, or authority concentrated in the hands of people obsessed with their own mortality, you're seeing Qin Shi Huang's legacy in action. The emperor thought he could conquer death by controlling life. Instead, he created a system of control that has outlasted him by 2,200 years and counting. In a twisted way, he did achieve immortality not through mercury elixirs, but through the oppressive systems that still bear his psychological fingerprints. But you're not powerless here. Understanding this pattern is the first step toward breaking it. When you can recognize death anxiety driving control systems, when you can see through the reasonable justifications to the underlying fear, when you can identify the immortality control cycle in its early stages, that's when you can resist it. If this video helped you see these patterns more clearly, hit that like button and let me know in the comments what modern examples remind you of Qin Shi Huang's tactics. And subscribe because next week, we're diving into how the Roman Empire used bread and circuses to create the world's first mass distraction system, and how the exact same psychological techniques are being used by social media platforms today. The past isn't dead. It's not even past, and your freedom depends on understanding that.